loss function. And there's a multiplicity of events. How do you keep that? Answers could be, well, that's the one you taught us. Answer is because I talked to the oligo, and there are several answers for sure.
This is a loss function for such a bank that there's inflation.
Okay. Where did you get that impression that the developer cares about those things?
From the statement.
Perfect. So you read the statement, and you're saying, these guys care about inflation and unemployment, or full employment. They don't tell you exactly the nature of the function. They tell you their objectives. That's one thing. The other thing that they tell you is that they cannot influence economic activity. And so that's it. And so the only thing that they can actually affect is the inflation rate, correct?
Yeah, it was a bit vague. At first they say that they have no control over it, but yet it's part of their mandate.
Right, no, but I think at one point they say something to the effect that inflation is ultimately determined by monetary policy.
And non-monetary force.
All right, so let's roll. Okay, we want to change the notation a little bit. Okay? Yeah, get rid of that. And my next suggestion would be to, in the second term, in the first square, is just to in the inflation. I think do you mean expected or do you mean target? And back to the unemployment, do you mean the natural rate? I don't want you to erase it just yet.
Sure.
Do you mean the natural rate or the target rate?
So eventually this will be replaced with the, like U star is some fraction of natural unemployment.
Right.
But I think I thought the loss function.
I think my suggestion is let's go with the target rate.
Just by itself, or?
Well, no, U minus U star. Is what Rohan is doing clear to you? There we go. And so notice that there are a couple of sources of ambiguity here. The first one is that if you use the natural rate as the target rate, then it would automatically yield the inflation product. What we did before was to then make an assumption about the relationship between the target rate and the natural rate. That's when we said U star equals sigma UN. What you did was if you put UN in there, what you're doing is setting sigma equal to 1, which is fine. But we want to, at this point, pretend that there's a gap between U star and UN. All right? Okay, so I don't want you to solve this. So what do you then do? You take the derivative of what with respect to what? Now, is that, this is my own fault, is that problem complete? Is this just go.
Which form?
What you're about to do is correct. Is Wade in here? Wade, where are you? No, I probably mispronounced it. His name is so bad. There it is.
He's not here.
He's not here, right? But Jason is in the last row. There's Matthew, by the way, just in case you don't know, there's Matthew right there. And Jason is in the last row. We are correct. All the way back, almost in the aisle. All right, so this is good. So what was the next step?
So, one in here.
Okay. And then what? So you have now a loss function that depends solely on the inflation rate. Then what?
So take the derivative with respect to the inflation.
And then what?
And then set that equal to 0.
That's right, DL d pi from where you're gonna get an expression for the inflation rate. Now, that expression for the inflation rate is going to depend on the natural rate, on the target rate, on the parameter rate, and on the expected inflation rate. What was the role that the assumption about rational expectations played in the solution?
I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, you wanna ask someone?
Sure.
Pick. Especially someone you don't like.
David?
David. David, what was the role of the what was the role of the what was the role of the assumption about the expectation of
Rational expectation.
Yeah.
That expected inflation would equal target inflation.
No. David, pick somebody else. Koshu, you're next.
Expected inflation equals actual inflation.
No, that's the assumption. The question is, what is the role of it
In this equation,
in the solution? Yeah.
we can set pi equals pi.
Keep talking. Don't stop now. Pi equals what?
Pi.
And then what? And then you can then solve. The point of the assumption is that you're going to have an expression that it is the inflation rate depends on a collection of things, one of which is the expected inflation rate. Okay? And the point of the assumption is to remove that dependency on the expected inflation rate by assuming that expectations are rational, which is another way of saying that individuals do not make systematic errors about their forecast for inflation. So you say pi e equals pi, and now you have one equation with one unknown, namely the inflation rate. That's the role of it, is to simplify the problem. Is to avoid the situation where you have to say, well, inflation depends on expected inflation. Well, that's not saying much. Okay? Right. Now, you have some questions, you and David have some questions here, so were these the questions you had in mind?
Yeah.
Oh,
Exactly what you asked is what should be the rational expectations.
okay. Is it clear now? No? Okay, so do you happen to have the expression for the equation for inflation?
Yeah, I think I remember it.
Okay, that's great.
No?
You want your notes?
No, I'm pretty sure this is what I had in there.
Well, keep going. I think what you mean by is the star.
Oh.
That's,
Instead of right over here?
no. Replace the E with an asterisk. Okay, put symbols in there. Right? 1 plus A squared government. At one point, that's the final solution. Okay. Couple of things to note. If sigma equals 1, then the actual inflation rate equals the target inflation rate. Sigma equals 1 amounts to substituting in the loss function you start with UN. Okay? Number 2, if W equals 0, that is, if the central bank does not care about unemployment, then we're back to inflation equals the target inflation rate. Okay, so we need to keep these things in mind. I think what I want is the solution that is the equation that is immediately before the solution, the one that has the expected inflation rate as part of the equation. Do you know what the expression for that equation is? Okay, Koshu, do you know what the equation is? Oh, he's hesitating. Ariel? Yeah, the equation that has the expected inflation rate. No.
No, you can put it back, the a plus, 1 plus a squared,
Yeah.
W, and then the one part is that.
Oh, pi minus pi star times that.
No, it's just, let's see if I can pick an embarrassing student or a student to embarrass. So it's going to be Hania.
Oh my god.
That's what I thought.
I probably will embarrass myself, that's for sure.
No, quite, no, we're not there yet. No, no, look, the thing is, Mrs. Coram, what I'm about to do is not the right thing, okay? It's not the right expression, but imagine that there was something else in here. Data. That depends on the expected inflation, suppose, okay? Then you will have that the actual inflation rate depends on these parameters, which are assumed to be part of the economy. This pi star, which is the target inflation rate, which is part of the central bank, and the expected inflation rate. And what we don't want is to have the solution depend on something that is not known, namely the expected inflation rate. And so what we then do is to say that the expected inflation rate equals the actual inflation rate. It is not a trick, though that's the way it comes across. It is not a trick. It says that on average, individuals do not make forecast errors. In other words, it's not that they're going to say that I expect the inflation rate to be 2%, it is 5. Okay, that was an error. Next year, what's going to be 2? It turns out to be 6. Well, another positive error. That's what this is ruling out. This is not perfect foresight. This is not divine authorities or communications with divine entities. This is the idea that individuals do not make forecast errors on average. Systematic forecast errors. In other words, if you are, thank you, Ron. In other words, that if you're going to go to a place and there's more than one route to that place, you don't always pick the one with the traffic and systematically make that error. What this is trying to do is to remove the belief that you make systematic errors, and therefore you say, on average, I nail it. Okay? Okay. Any questions from that? Peter, you have some remarks about Rohan's performance, or? Okay, Vivian? We're okay? P.
I had a question.
Go.
So when we're doing this equation, some things like, I don't know if it's just like a preference, but if you do the equation only works if you do some of these assumptions at certain points. So if we put this rational expectations at the beginning, right, that whole A term drops out. And so now, and then it's never in the equation.
That's right.
So it's like, is there like a reason why we only do it at certain steps? Is just for convenience of the algebra, or?
No, it's no convenience. But Ivana knows the answer. Ivana? Ivana doesn't know the answer. I apologize, Ivana. Sharju.
I'm not sure. I mean, initially, I didn't have the 1 plus a square w term, to be honest.
Yeah, I know.
I assume pi is equal to pi, and that initial term a, you know.
Don't worry about Rohan's algebra.
So basically, you know, assuming that initially made my entire mathematics a lot simpler.
We're now in Pete's questions. He's saying that you solve the problem, okay, and it is at a particular point in the solution of that problem that you invoke the rational expectation assumption, and that if you do it that way, then yes, you get the right expression, or the expression that we derive. He's asking, why do I have to substitute it then and not before? And in particular, he notes that if you were to start the problem by assuming rational expectation, then the expected inflation will not be part of that. Correct? Do I have this right, Pete?
Mm-hmm.
Koshu, what do you say is Pete's? What do you say to him?
I think we ideally want to get to that equation with beta and pi e,
Yeah.
and show that we do have two variables for one equation, and then for the moment we're going to assume that it's expected inflation is actual inflation. If something better comes up, we can.
That's the right
Substitute.
intuition. Let me, there are two answers to your question. The first one is this, that if you assume that individuals have rational expectations, if you, the student solving the problem, then you will find that if individuals have rational expectations, then there's not gonna be any problem to solve, right? Because the Phillips curve is U equals UN, and we're done. And so if the unemployment rate is always at the natural rate, then what is the problem? What we have to keep in mind here is that it's not you or I solving the problem, that it is the central bank solving the problem. And if we then tell the central bank, oh, individuals have rational expectations, so you can proceed on that assumption, then the central bank say, well, then I don't have a role. That's one of the messages of this line of work. It says that the central bank has absolute no power to influence the economy because individuals have rational expectations. Monetary policy is completely ineffective, okay? If you tell the central bank that individuals have rational expectations. So when people talk about the rational expectation revolution, this is what, your observation is what they have in mind. The moment the central bank assumes that individuals have rational expectations, then monetary policy is completely ineffective. It will not be able to affect a thing. So that's one. The second component is that, well, we don't know if the individuals have rational expectations. We know they have expectations. And so we then go and solve the problem without assuming the nature of their without assuming the character of their expectations. So they have expectations, we don't know what they are. And so we go and solve the problem. And then we get to that equation where the actual inflation rate depends on the expected inflation rate. And at that point you says, well, I need now to supplement the exercise with an auxiliary assumption about the character of expectations. And what I do is I'm going to assume that they are rational. But notice that it is now an additional layer of assumptions that we're imposing on the problem. We didn't, if we start with that assumption from the beginning, we're done, because there's no Phillips curve. And so what we do is let's not assume the character of inflation or expectation. Let's assume that they are what they are. And so you solve the problem, and then you get that term that has the expected inflation. Now what? Well, now at that point you can say they are rational, or they are idiotic, or they are zero, or they are something else. So you're not compelled to have rational expectations. And so the nature of the solution is if expectations were rational, then this will happen. The last segment of the course is going to be about what happens when inflations are not, when expectations are not rational. There is a new branch of, it's a new movement in economics that is called behavioral economics that views expectations not as, they argue against rational expectations. And what they're doing is saying, well, for me to form my expectations, I look information around me, and I look at what you're expecting, what Mariel is expecting, what Coach is expecting, what Mauricio is expecting, and then I form my own expectations. Okay? We're gonna see that at the end of the course. Okay. Any questions from what we have done so far? Okay. So, Rohan, thank you very much, and Coach Shu and Dave, and Ivan. Who else did I manage to offend in the process? Ivan, Ariel, Sharjo. Okay, good. Let's go. So this is, I'm going to repeat a little bit of what we did before. Remember the evolution of the thinking. We began, or at least of the profession, we began with the ISLM step. That is a really neat derivation, except that it doesn't tell you what the incentives of the monetary authorities are. And if it doesn't tell you what the incentives are, then we have this puzzle of how do we know that the central bank is not going to try to be above equilibrium? Stage one. Stage two. Well, we can fix that problem by having a model that has explicitly the structural preferences of the central bank. And we combine those preferences with the, let me call it, with the side of the economy as embodied in the Phillips curve. And then that says, oh, now, once you see it that way, then I understand why would the government will have an incentive to deviate from equilibrium, namely the government will be better off. That automatically triggers a trade-off between being better off today and being worse off in the future. Whether that, the character of that trade-off depends on the discount rate. And fine, so, but we don't want to reach that point just to be enlightened by the preference that we cannot observe. What we want is to extract out of that framework a set of implications for conducting monetary policy. And the main implication that we get out of that is that unless the central bank faces a shelling scheme that is something that prevents something that I'm just not remember the name. I don't remember the name. A process whereby preferences in the future are prohibited from manifesting themselves.
Showing the anticipatory self-command.
Name. Yeah. So there has to be some, you know, that David, now David's kind of saying, hey, I don't want to be with Rohan anymore, I'm kind of it's just I'm that good, so, you know, Rohan kind of, and that thing about the inflation being equal to the expected, talking about the same thing with self-referential things, that didn't quite work out. So let me put the self-anticipatory constraints. That's the thing that I was looking at. So the central bank wants that, because what it wants is to prevent its preferences in the future from manifesting themselves. And now we have a collection of methods of bringing shelling into the picture. One is what Kinlan and Prescott did, which is, well, I can show you that if you have that there's a distinction between consistency and optimality. And so what we need to do is to derive a set of rules. And that if those rules were actually followed, then we're going to be in equilibrium at all times. Fine, but then what exactly ensures the following of those rules? Well, you know, being, I don't know, I promise you that I will follow the rules, but other than just words, it's not gonna work. So we brought into the picture the conservative central banker. And we can see that if we knew that someone was an honest-to-God conservative central banker, that individual could deliver the equilibrium and keep it there. But we don't know what a conservative central banker is, and there's no DNA, or there's not a conservative central bank chromosome. And so we're now back into, we don't know. Now, then we have this incentive scheme to say, I don't care if you're conservative or liberal, or I don't care about your views. The structure that we have in here will ensure that you have enough of incentive to behave as though you were a conservative. Now that is a contrived scheme. The New Zealand guys tried it, didn't quite work, and I think they ditched it, right? Because essentially the central bank is going to take a pay cut for reasons that are beyond his or her control. I mean, if you tell me that I'm going to take a pay cut if I don't show up exactly at 8 o'clock, fine, that's under my control. But if the inflation in the rest of the world increases, and in New Zealand inflation increases, well, that's not really my fault. And so, but I'm gonna take the pay cut just the same. And so that scheme didn't quite work either. We can talk to the New Zealand guys about it. And then we came up with something called inflation targeting. And inflation targeting is what it's trying to do is two things. First, to let the public know what the central bank is doing. So communication strategy is of the essence in inflation targeting. And second, the next is for the central bank to adopt a mechanism whereby the decisions to change monetary policy are limited. It is not just limited and not tell anyone. It's limited, and I tell you and I tell the public what my limitations are. And that seems to work. What is next is, and this is where we are, well, how do we translate that intuition about inflation targeting into a real equation? Not into some bunch of words, not into some bunch of ideas and epiphanies. put an equation. Show me the equation. That's what these guys do. Now, again, there have been many approaches to the design of policy rules or multi-policy rules. The beauty of Taylor is the simplicity of it. The beauty of it is that if you say, I can understand it by just looking at it. Every single variable in that equation is observable, or at least can be estimated. Everyone. It's not going to depend on the preferences of the central bank. It's not going to depend on some other things that if we knew, then it would be great, but that we cannot never know. All right, so what I like to do is to go more or less quickly about what we did for the Taylor rule, and then get down to the derivation of it, the actual equation. So Taylor begins with the quantity theory. This is as uncontroversial as it gets. This is saying, I'm going to start with a quantity that 2 equals 2. Next. The next thing is to take logs of that. The third thing is to make an assumption about the velocity of money. This is not a particularly contrived assumption, but it is an assumption. There's nothing that says that we have to take the log of velocity and make it equal to the interest rate in the log of income. Nothing. We could have said here plus something else, plus the fiscal deficit. We could have done that. That's not what Taylor did. Then you substitute this expression, okay, so that's the assumption. Then you take the logs of the quantity theory, you solve for the log of m, and then you substitute in here, you're gonna be substituting in here the assumption that we made for the velocity of money. So 1 second, let me just. Okay, good. And so you make that assumption, you see, we're gonna replace here with that assumption over there, and we solve for the interest rate. Strictly speaking, we're done. And this is the solution for the interest rate. Taylor doesn't quite stop there. What he wants is to say, well, this is what looks like an equilibrium interest rate, but it's an equilibrium relative to something that we don't see. I don't know what the equilibrium interest rate is. And so what he wants is to say, let's study deviations of the interest rate from this postulated equilibrium interest rate, and let's design a method that takes us back there. And so then you take differences of that equation, and you get this equation here. Now notice that this equation is not, these changes are not what we normally understand as changes of the value today minus the value in the previous period. This is the value today relative to something else. And that something else is not the previous value, that something else is the equilibrium value of the interest rate, the equilibrium value of economic activity. And so this symbol delta can be, most of the time it's understood to mean change relative to the previous period. But it doesn't have to be defined that way, to be change, deviation from the reference point. And the reference point in here is, for the interest rate, is going to be the target interest rate. Okay, right now in the United States, to have the Federal Reserve state what the target interest rate is the big prize. Second, the second term is the change, the delta log of m. That's called the structural inflation rate. When we go sequentially, this looks like a weird thing to say, because what is the structural inflation rate, and why would I be associating the change in the log of n with the structural inflation rate? This equation here is stating an article of faith by economists that inflation is everywhere and every time ultimately a monetary phenomenon. And so that on average, the growth rate of the money supply constitutes what economists call the structural inflation rate. So the structural inflation rate differs from the actual, because if there is an increase in the price of oil or a decrease in the price of product, the actual inflation rate is going to differ from the structural one. So the idea here is that we're going to take data that we can observe, namely the growth rate of the money supply, we're going to take an average of it, and we're going to call that the structural inflation rate. it is not a strictly derived proposition. What it's doing is saying, on average, countries that have high growth rates of the money supply also have high inflation rates. And we're gonna call that structural to differentiate that inflation rate from business cycle consideration. The next term is the delta log of y. We're now going to assert that that can be expressed as a gap between the growth rate of actual output and the growth rate of potential output. Let's poke somebody. That's Lexi. What is the growth rate of output, the growth rate of GDP in the United States now?
Right now, it was released at 4% for the quarter.
Beautiful, right? And so Lexi was saying that this growth rate of output is 4%. And then the issue is that fast or slow? Well, it has to be relative to something. And that something is what we call the growth rate of potential output. Lexi, and if we had a little discussion about what we mean by the growth rate of potential output. So do you happen to remember, or what is your view on the growth rate of potential output?
Probably around 2 or 2.5%.
Let's call it that's 2.5, let's split the difference. So we're now in the United States growing above potential. Okay? That's gonna come back in a moment. But for the time being, we are growing above potential. Then we have delta log of P. Again, this looks contrived, but check this. When the inflation rate equals the target rate, so with the term in parentheses equals 0, then delta LMP is the structural rate. It can be higher if the inflation rate exceeds the target rate, or it can be lower if the inflation rate is below the target rate. Let's bring somebody else to the show. Peter, what is the target inflation rate for the United States? 2%. I just want to make sure that I heard right.
Yes.
2%. And what do you think is the current inflation rate for the United States, the CPI inflation rate?
Isn't it a little bit over, like 2.3-ish, around there?
Tanya, no, Tanya. What is the current inflation rate of the United States?
I was actually gonna say the same thing, to be honest.
Okay, well, in that case, let's go to person. David, what is the inflation rate of the United States?
2.1.
That's what they're saying. They're saying it's a little bit above.
No, for sure.
Okay, I think it's a little less than 2%. But I could be wrong, right? Oh, he's gonna go and check too.
Well, no, I will.
Go to it. Okay. And then I'm gonna say you picked the wrong website. All right. And so there's going to be a gap between the actual inflation rate and the target inflation rate. If that gap is absent, then the inflation rate is just a structural rate. Okay, so now what do we do with all of this? The next thing to do is notice I'm now going to start making substitutions. We're not gonna go step by step in here. So delta R is the difference between the interest rate and the target rate. And notice that what I've been doing now is making is substituting the assumptions that are in the previous slide. All right, so you start grinding this, and here comes the first or the next big assumption. Is what do we have for the target interest rate? Well, notice that the Federal Reserve, there's no central bank that says that. And so what they do, what's done instead is to say that the target interest rate is going to be equal to the inflation rate plus the target real interest rate. Does this term, let me see if I have something in here, yes. Does this look like something that you recognize? It has a name. It has the name of an individual. Did we not cover the Fisher equation? This is the Fisher equation. And the interest rate should be equal to the real rate plus, in this case, the expected, they say the expected inflation rate. And so notice, I'm trying to sell you the Taylor rule. Notice that if growth equals potential and the inflation rate equals the target rate so that these terms are zero, then the optimal interest rate from Taylor's viewpoint is replicating Fisher equation. So it is not that it's going to say it's some other weird thing. It's consistent with Fisher equations that the nominal rate ought to be equal to the real rate plus inflation. And then this is the Taylor rule. So it says the interest rate equals the inflation rate plus something that is not really observable, the target real interest rate, deviations of output from potential deviations of inflation from the target. The next issue that arises in here is, okay, now that's really neat. Well, what is gamma and beta? That's because if you tell me that you're expressing great ideas in terms of something that is not known, then we're just spinning wheels. We're not doing anything really. And so that's gonna brings us to Jason. Jason, if you have to pick values for gamma and beta, what values would you pick? For what it's worth, you did this already in the first assignment.
So for gamma will be some negative value, and for beta will be positive.
So minus infinity plus infinity.
Oh no.
Right? Well, they are both negative. They're both consistent with your answer. So let's go with for the gamma first. So you're saying that if let's pick gamma equals -1. Okay. So when output is above potential, the Federal Reserve should lower the interest rate.
Sorry, we should increase. Sorry.
Should increase, right? So we want both guys positive. The next issue is, well, what values? So they're going to be both positive. The next is what value? Should I put here 100 for gamma and 6 million for beta? That looks weird, right? But therefore, we're going to exclude those guys. So what values will you use? Try to remember the first simulation exercise that we did in here. What were the values in the policy rule?
Somewhere between 0 and 1.
Okay, so we're narrowing down, but I don't want ambiguities. I want a number. Jason, don't worry.
Half and half?
Nay. Half and half. Well, why not? I mean, what's wrong with Jason's? Why not say 0.25 and 0.75?
Because I think, as you mentioned earlier, we want a specific rule to follow. So if you can change the variables according to your will, then it's not a rule anymore. It's
I agree. But we're not changing. One second, because we're not changing. We're saying 0.25, 0.75, fixed forever.
Okay.
What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that from the standpoint of me trying to sell to you this result?
That means you have a difference in terms of unemployment rate and inflation, and you can make enemies because of that.
Perfect. And so Taylor is trying to sell this to us, and the very first thing he does, and this is from a, if you want a pedagogical or a strategic standpoint, he says, I'm going to have a rule that tells that the central bank cares equally about both. And so whether this is true or not is not relevant to Taylor. Whether this is what central banks do or do not do is not relevant to Taylor. He's trying to persuade us about the usefulness of this rule. And he starts by saying that it should be constant coefficients. Equal values. Okay? And so notice the technique. He's starting with, I will get to your question in this. He's starting with an identity, the quantity theory, then performs a collection of derivations, none of which are particularly offensive or repugnant, then makes a couple of assumptions along the way, none of which is particularly, and then it arrives at this equation in here, and it says, how am I going to sell this equation if I don't know what gamma and beta are? Have I arrived, am I fooling myself? Is this a delusion? And it says, well, I'm just gonna set gamma and beta to be 0.5. Because that means then that the central bank cares equally about both. That's a good trick, caution.
So two questions. One is on notation, so this beta at the end, is that still the same beta from up there? Cause then that's,
The same beta as of where?
Third last line, right?
the last line, beta.
Well, unless I made an error, it's the same.
Because then that would mean 1 over A equals beta. But like if you go back a slide, or 2 slides, I don't know, then that would be, then V equals A R plus 1 over A, then Y, which doesn't really make sense to me.
I'm just not following. See, how about, I can set beta equal to 0.5 in here, right?
Yeah, but could you go back?
Go back?
Could you go
Down or
forward,
up?
sorry, down, yeah.
This?
Another down, yeah. So like from the third last
Okay,
to the second last,
yeah.
basically the conversion is A over alpha is
Oh,
beta.
I apologize.
So
I see-
that's a
I-
notation difference.
It's a notation
Okay.
difference, my apologies.
Second question,
But before we go there, do you see what Kosh is saying? He's saying that effectively that I screwed up. Right? That this beta here cannot be that beta there. Okay? And so that's what he's being polite about the whole thing, He's saying that's a notational change, and yeah, it's a notational change. Thank you.
okay, so beta is A over, 1 over A, and gamma equals 1 minus beta over A. Is that, okay, the first beta. The second question is, if we set, gamma and beta, they both equal to 0.5,
Yes.
then that would basically mean 1 over beta, the first beta, over alpha equals 1 over alpha. That would basically mean beta is 0. So if you go back 2 slides.
No, we cannot have it both ways, right? I already acknowledge that this thing here is not the same as that. So you're not gonna, I acknowledge that. So this, let me just put here beta prime.
Okay, so let's say if gamma equals beta point, whatever.
Yeah, prime, yeah.
Prime, then that would mean 1 over beta, first beta, over alpha equals 1 over alpha, right?
I think, do you want me to change the label completely to this?
No.
Okay, so.
I'll call it the first beta and second beta.
Okay, so call,
If-
let me just do this. Right? I'm gonna call that M.
Okay.
Oh, well.
And 1 over alpha is n.
No, I'm gonna call this N,
That's n.
yeah, or P.
Okay. By setting gamma equals to beta prime, that would basically mean m equals 1 over alpha, right?
Let's go to the. So I want you to write 1 minus beta over alpha.
If we set it in the example 0.5 from
Right.
before,
Keep going.
and gamma equals 1 over first beta over alpha equals, right?
No, that would be,
So that would set beta equals to 0.
no. Okay, so set to 0.
Yeah, so if you go two slides back, basically beta is first coming from,
We're,
I forgot what it was.
Plus beta times log of y.
Yeah.
yeah,
But this is gonna cancel as
No,
well.
I know, that sounds like I made an error in the, it's a notational change, but let me just, let's erase that. Well, I can do it here, so that's what. Oh, but wait a second, if I have beta equals 0 here, I still have the effect of output.
But we subbed in
but
that
we're-
first
we
velocity
assumed that.
equation.
This is, I have to substitute in the velocity. This expression here is the velocity here, so beta, you can say beta equals 0. And all we will be saying is that the income elasticity equals, that the coefficient associated with y will be equal to 1.
Well, he's
That
he's
wouldn't
looking
come
at
in the
the
first place,
equation.
because the very first one, that's gonna be basically.
True, well,
maintained.
okay, so ditch that, you still have this term in here, right? Okay?
Yeah.
So you can cross that, you can cross this, you will be saying that the log of velocity depends solely on the interest rate. You can say that, but you still have the quantity theory here that says that income matters. Okay? Alright. Okay, so back to the values of alpha and beta, of gamma and beta. So there are 0.5. And when we pick values of 0.5, we are in effect saying that deviations, that this central bank treats deviations of output from potential and deviations of inflation from target as equally important. What I like to do now is to illustrate something that you already solved for yourself. What I like is for you to assume that growth rate equals potential growth rate, that the target inflation, that the inflation rate equals the target inflation rate. So if you substitute these expressions into the Taylor rule, then you get Fisher equation. I want you to assume now that the inflation rate is 2 and the real rate is 2, and so you get a nominal interest rate of 4. Okay, nothing particularly complicated in here. Here is where your first assignment shows up. I want you to assume that output equals, the growth rate of output equals the potential, but that now there's a gap between the inflation rate and the target rate, and that gap equals 1. What would that imply for the change in the interest rate? Well, so it will be, the change in the Taylor rule rate will be the change in inflation rate plus 0.5 times the deviation. So that would be about 1.5. This is what's known as the Taylor principle. The guys in economics love, and I mean love, to attach big names to simple algebraic results. And so this is called the Taylor principle. It is not that we're just running out of things to do and so we come up with names. The idea is that this result indicates that if the inflation rate were to increase by 1% above the target, the interest rate will have to increase by more than proportional. So when you saw in your simulation that the case where the inflation responds a lot initially, what you're seeing there is the Taylor principle in action. The question is, okay, so that's a principle. If you code the principle in Excel, then you see the principle in numbers. What's the advantage of that? Why do we have to have that principle? Megan, why do we have to have that principle? I mean, why couldn't we have that an increase in the interest? I mean, look at this expression in here, the Fisher equation. So this Fisher equation, if we were to adhere to that equation, if the inflation rate increases by 1%, the interest rate should increase by 1%. But then we have this Taylor thing that says, well, no, the interest rate is going to increase by more than the increase in the inflation rate. What is that giving us? If you don't feel comfortable, as a reward, you can pick somebody else. Why don't you pick Matthew?
Okay.
He's over there. Matthew, what about it?
I think the whole idea of this Taylor thing is trying to target the inflation. So
Right.
target inflation and control the interest rate, real rate.
Well, very close, very close. The idea is this, and this is part of a strategy that I want you to start adopting or thinking about when the question comes in and you don't know, you don't even know where to begin to look for the answer, okay? Think about what are the alternatives. The alternative is for the interest rate to increase by less than the inflation rate. So what would that do? Well, if the interest rate increases by less, so imagine that this goes up, pi goes up by 1, and that somehow r goes up by 0.5, well, that means that the real interest rate is actually declining. Okay? Which then means that whatever factors gave rise to the initial expansion in the inflation rate are still in place. If you raise the interest rate by exactly, this is not gonna work. Let me just do it. So the gap between r and pi is the real interest rate. Okay. And everything was fine, and then one day what happens is that there's an increase in the inflation rate. Let's just call that by 1. So that this distance here is 1. If we were to increase the nominal rate by 1, then the gap between the real interest rate, between the nominal rate and the inflation rate has not changed. And what that means is that monetary policy wants to tank, let me put it that way, tank the economy. The monetary policy wants to contract the economy so that the inflation rate then returns back to its target. And if it just raises the nominal rate by exactly the amount of the inflation rate, then the central bank is actually doing nothing. Because whatever factors gave rise to the increase in inflation rate in here are going to be still present once the nominal rate goes up by the exact amount. And so the nominal rate has to increase by more than the increase in the inflation rate, so as to raise the real. So if the interest rate increases, delta R is greater than the increase in the inflation rate, that implies the real rate increases. And if the real rate increases, then that means investment declines, that means output declines, and that means inflation rate declines to the target. That's the point of the Taylor principle. That if you don't do this, if you don't raise the interest rate by more than the increase in the inflation rate, then what's going to happen? But what's going to happen is that this process will not be activated. Therefore, if the real interest rate does not increase, then economic activity will continue to expand, the inflation rate will continue to increase, and the central bank is going to look like a bunch of idiots because they have the power to change it, to bring the economic activity down so as to bring the inflation rate down. That's the bite of the Taylor principle. That if you want to target the inflation rate, you have to have large swings in the interest rate so as to keep the economy from expanding so as to avoid the increase in the inflation rate. Okay? So that's the Taylor principle. Okay. We're going to do a little exercise on the Taylor rule. But I want to raise annoying questions before that. me see if I can bring this. Okay, this is a file that I want you to be working, but we're gonna bring the Taylor rule in the meantime. This line in here, the short dash, is the actual federal funds rate. The blue line is a particular version of the Taylor rule, and the dash dot is another version of the Taylor rule. At this point, what I want is, how do you interpret, or how would one interpret the gap between what the Taylor rule is saying and what the actual federal funds rate is? How would one interpret that? Well, there are two interpretations. One interpretation, and this is the one that Taylor prefers, is that whenever there is a gap between the Taylor rule and the actual, that emerges or is the result of a policy mistake. In this case, Taylor would interpret this gap as saying the monetary policy in the United States is being overly expansionary. That the interest rate that should have prevailed is not this, but that. And so to the extent that the actual interest rate is below the Taylor rate, then that's interpreted as measuring the stance of monetary policy. This gap in here will be expansionary monetary policy. So that's what he will call a policy mistake. But that's one way of looking at things. The other possibility is to say, well, maybe it's a modeling mistake. How do I get, is it true that in the United States the coefficients are 0.5 and 0.5? What other assumptions went into the crafting of that path for the Taylor rule? And why do we take those as given or as correct? We're going to be doing a little more work on that, but for the time being, I want you to see that there's more, that there's going to be a gap between the policy rate and the actual rate. And that, to the extent that the central bank does not follow the Taylor rule, then to that extent, Taylor interprets that as a policy mistake. Okay? So that's one possibility. So that's one interpretation. There are a couple of alternatives that I want you to consider. The way the Taylor rule was derived, it says, if there's a gap between the inflation rate and the target rate, or if there's a gap between growth and actual growth, the interest rate reacts by those magnitudes. Just go back. Here. If there's a gap between the potential growth rate and, the actual and potential, then this tells monetary authorities change the interest rate now, by whatever amount the Taylor rule prescribes. If there's a gap between the inflation rate and the target, change the interest rates now. Now, if you were to do that, and you will have a chance to do it, you will see that the policy rates has a great deal of volatility. And that's not what we see. And so what we're trying to, and that's not what central banks want either. Central banks want to set interest rate, but they don't want interest rate volatility because that gets in the way of firms and individuals' plans. And so the way we characterize that is by saying that the central bank is going to take a weighted average between two things. The first thing in here, determined in square brackets, is the prediction from the Taylor rule, and the other is the previous value of the interest rate. And so the central bank says, today's interest rate, then I'm just going to pick a number, is 2. For next period, the Taylor rule tells us that it ought to be 3. But we're not going to switch from 2 to 3 overnight. What we're going to do instead is to take an average between the 2 and the 3. And if the weights are the same, that's going to be about 2.5. And so it is taking into account history. That's why we call it persistence. That is, the central bank does not determine the interest rate without any regard to previous history. And so we call that persistence. And you will have a chance to see this in action. The second component is that for monetary policy is about being proactive, not about being reactive. And so what matters isn't so much the gap between potential and growth rate and the actual. What matters is the forecast for that gap. And what matters is not so much the deviation between inflation rate and potential and target. What matters is the forecast for that gap. And so those forecasts come in, fit into the Taylor rule, and then tell us what the interest rate should be today. Now, what we're going to do is going to involve combining persistence with forecast. There's an Excel file that has this, and you will see, and I will show you how to do it, okay? But for the time being is persistence and forecasts. Why do we need forecast? Well, there are two arguments that have been made. The first one is called the recognition lag. This is the example that I had before, that you're on the beach and there's this gigantic wave is coming at you, and then you have several choices, ditch, learn how to swim, or worse to that effect. There's going to be a delay between you seeing the wave and you being able to take evasive action. So that's what I call the recognition lag. The glitch is that we don't have, here's the example that Lexi brought up. Lexi, what was the information that you brought up about the GDP?
That US GDP for the quarter was 4%.
For what quarter?
For the second quarter.
So that's a while ago. It's not now. It's not the same that we are now growing at 4%. So we get information about the economy with a lag. And so Lex is saying, well, for Q2 in the United States, Q2 ended. So we're saying, it's almost like saying, well, and it was X million % right after the Declaration of Independence. Well, who cares about that, right? The issue is that we are getting information with a lag. We don't know right now what is the current growth rate of the United States. We don't know right now what is the current inflation rate of the United States. We know what it was a month ago. We know what it was a quarter ago. And so we're in terms of information, we're always catching up. So that's the recognition lag. The second lag that matters is what's called the reaction lag. That even if we had minute by minute information on the growth rate of GDP, minute, never ending. The moment we see a gap between the inflation rate and the target rate, and the moment we decide to take a decision to avoid that gap, it is going to be a little while before the moment you take the decision, the moment that decision is felt. And so for these two reasons, the central bank that follows this procedure do not like all that much the idea of not using forecasts. So in policy work, what's done is you use Taylor rule with persistence, with forecasts. Anything else is just talk. Anything else is just playing around. All right. What are the complications? Well, I the way I described to you, using forward-looking Taylor rules is the way to go. But now it matters because we don't know what's going to be the inflation rate in the future, and so we need to forecast. And forecasting the inflation rate now has to adopt a particular model for the inflation rate and a particular estimation of the parameters of that model. So you can see the extent to which we don't have perfect models and perfect estimation methods. We're now going to be forecasting the inflation subject to measurement errors, subject to modeling errors, subject to estimation errors. And so forecast errors are now creeping into the policy process. Right? The second, right, if I'm going to forecast inflation rate by looking at the number of white cars on Massachusetts Avenue, well, that's a method. But that doesn't make it any good. And so if that happens to be the method that I use, then I'm going to be forecasting the inflation rate wrong. And that mistake in the forecast is going to feed into the policy decision. And that's bad news. The second component is, well, okay, suppose that you have a perfect method, and suppose, or as good as a method as it gets, and suppose that Then you have estimation methods, good models, and the rest. For how long should you forecast? For example, is next quarter enough? Is next year enough? How far of an inflation forecast the Federal Reserve needs to make a decision today? Should they go all the way to 2020 and say, well, nothing is really gonna happen between now and then, or maybe by 2020, it's gonna be crap. So we have to do something about it today. Right? It's not that we're gonna wait until 2019 and then do something with it. We're gonna wait it. You know who he is, right? You know his name. It's Demetrius. Hi, Demetrius. We can say hi to Demetrius. Hi, Demetrius. All right. And so, how far into the future you want to forecast in order to be able to make a decision? I don't know the answer to that question, okay, but it matters. All right. So, what I'd like to do now, why don't we take a break, because the next stop is completely started. You just showed up in time for the break. You should have waited a little while.